Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson, a rancher by the name of Thomas would sit on his porch, staring out into the vast expanse beyond the hills. The land stretched endlessly, dotted with sagebrush and cacti, where the wind whispered secrets through the dry air. It was here, in this quiet solitude, that he noticed it. Smoke curling lazily into the heavens, faint but unmistakable. At first, he thought little of it. Perhaps some traveler had stopped for the night, or maybe a wandering cowboy lit a fire to fend off the chill. But as days turned into weeks, the smoke never ceased. Every night, like clockwork, it rose from the same place, just over those distant hills. Thomas was not a man prone to superstition, but there was something unsettling about the sight. He owned a modest ranch, nestled at the edge of the frontier, far enough from any town to feel truly alone, yet close enough to occasionally hear the distant rumble of wagons heading west. His life had been simple, rising with the sun, tending to his cattle, and watching the stars come alive as twilight gave way to night. But now, this mysterious smoke gnawed at him, a question mark etched into the horizon. Who could be out there, and why did they remain hidden? The nights grew colder as autumn crept in, and still the smoke persisted. On one particularly clear evening, when the moon hung full and bright above the desert landscape, Thomas decided he could no longer ignore the mystery. He saddled his horse, an old chestnut mare named Ruby, and prepared to ride toward the hills. As he tightened the cinch of her saddle, he glanced back at his cabin, its wooden walls weathered by years of wind and rain. Inside, a lantern flickered softly, casting shadows that danced across the floorboards. For a moment, doubt lingered in his mind. What if it was nothing? What if he returned home only to find himself laughing at his own curiosity? But then, another thought struck him. What if it wasn't nothing? What if danger lurked beyond those hills, waiting silently in the dark? With a deep breath, Thomas mounted Ruby and set off into the night. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of mesquite and dust. The ground beneath them crunched with every step, and the silence of the desert seemed almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of brush as small creatures scurried away. The hills loomed ahead, their jagged edges silhouetted against the starlit sky. Each ridge he crossed brought him closer to the source of the smoke, yet also deeper into uncertainty. Little did he know, this journey would unravel more than just a mystery. It would challenge everything he believed about the world around him. As Ruby climbed the final rise, Thomas held his breath, anticipation gripping him like a vice. Beyond the crest lay a valley bathed in moonlight, its contours softened by the silver glow. At its center stood what appeared to be a campsite, though unlike any he had ever seen. A large fire crackled merrily, sending sparks spiraling upward like fireflies caught in a dance. Around it were tents, makeshift structures crafted from animal hides and scraps of cloth. Lanterns hung from tree branches, their light swaying gently in the breeze. Smoke curled lazily from the flames, mingling with the cool night air. But it was the people who drew Thomas's attention most sharply. They moved with purpose, their figures cloaked in shadow, performing tasks that seemed mundane yet carried an air of secrecy. Some tended to the fire, others checked supplies stacked neatly nearby, while a few sat cross-legged, engaged in quiet conversation. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though each action held meaning beyond mere survival. Yet none of them spoke loudly. The only sound was the crackle of wood burning and the soft shuffle of boots against dirt. Thomas dismounted Ruby, tying her reins to a nearby bush so she wouldn't wander. He approached cautiously, staying low and using the cover of boulders and shrubs to remain unseen. From his vantage point, he observed every detail, searching for clues that might explain this gathering. These weren't ordinary settlers or travelers. They moved too confidently, as though they belonged here, unbothered by the isolation. And then he noticed something else. Weapons, rifles leaned against tents, holsters strapped tightly to hips, knives glinting faintly under the lantern light. Whoever these people were, they were prepared for trouble or causing it. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine as realization dawned upon him. This wasn't just a group camping in the wilderness. No, this was something far more organized, far more dangerous. But what exactly were they doing out here, so far from civilization? Were they bandits, hiding in plain sight until the time came to strike? Or perhaps smugglers, moving goods illegally across borders undetected? Whatever the case, Thomas knew he couldn't simply turn back without understanding more. Not now, not after coming this far. He edged closer, careful to keep himself concealed among the rocks. The voices grew clearer, snippets of conversation drifting toward him on the wind. One man spoke with authority, gesturing emphatically as he addressed the group. "We can't afford mistakes," he said firmly, his tone sharp enough to cut through the night. "If anyone finds out, we're finished." Another voice chimed in, lower but equally urgent. "But how long can we keep this up? Sooner or later, someone will notice." "Then we make sure they don't," came the reply, cold and calculating. There was a pause, filled only by the crackle of the fire, before the leader continued. "Tomorrow night, we move. Everything must be ready by then." Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Move? Where are they going and why? Before he could dwell further on their words, a sudden noise behind him shattered the fragile calm. Ruby, spooked by a rustling sound in the brush, let out a startled whinny. In an instant, all eyes in the camp turned toward him. "Who's there?" called the leader, his voice cutting to the tension like a knife. Thomas cursed silently, knowing he'd been discovered. He emerged slowly from his hiding spot, raising his hands in surrender as several figures stepped forward, rifles drawn. The leader, a tall man with piercing eyes and a scar running along his jawline, studied him intently. "What are you doing here?" the man demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. I saw the smoke," Thomas stammered, trying to sound as innocent as possible. "Thought someone might need help." The leader narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Help? Out here?" "Convenient story, rancher." One of the others snorted derisively. "Maybe he's following us. Could be trouble." "No," Thomas protested quickly, shaking his head. "I swear I'm just a rancher. Live right over the hill. Never meant to intrude." The leader exchanged a glance with his companions before nodding slightly. "All right, rancher. Let's say we believe you for now. But understand this. Whatever you've seen tonight stays between us. If word gets out..." He left the threat hanging, letting it sink in fully. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Until this moment, he hadn't fully grasped the gravity of stumbling upon such a secret. Now, faced with these men, he realized just how perilous his curiosity had become. Reluctantly, he nodded, agreeing to their terms even as unease settled heavily in his chest. They allowed him to leave, though not before ensuring he understood the consequences of betrayal. As Thomas rode back toward his ranch, the events of the night replayed endlessly in his mind. The camp, the weapons, the cryptic conversation, all pointed to something far greater than mere smuggling or outlaw activity. But what? And why had they chosen this remote location to conduct their operations? Questions swirled like tumbleweeds in a storm, each one leading to another, leaving him both intrigued and terrified. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep eluded him. Instead, he paced a small room, his thoughts consumed by the possibilities. Perhaps these men were involved in something illegal, yes, but what if there was more? What if their presence here hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that extended beyond the frontier itself? Days passed, and Thomas found himself torn between two paths. On one hand, he could stay silent, keeping the promise made under duress and hoping the matter resolved itself without incident. On the other, he could investigate further, risking everything to uncover the truth. Yet, as much as he tried to convince himself of the former, the latter gnawed at him relentlessly. Something about the camp felt wrong, unbelievable even, like a piece of a puzzle missing its edges, waiting to fit into a picture far grander than he could imagine. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Thomas made his decision. He would return to the hills, but this time armed with caution and determination, gathering supplies and ensuring Ruby was well rested. He set out Once more, the weight of his choice settling heavily on his shoulders. As he approached the familiar ridgeline, the wind carried with a strange sense of foreboding, whispering warnings only he could hear. Yet, despite the unease, he pressed on, driven by a need to know the truth. When he arrived at the campsite, however, it was eerily empty. The tents stood abandoned, their contents hastily packed away. The fire pit remained cold and blackened, evidence of recent use but devoid of life. Panic surged within him as he searched the area, calling out in vain. Had they already moved? Or worse, had they anticipated his return and fled? Taking precautions against discovery? It wasn't until he ventured deeper into the valley that he stumbled upon something unexpected. A hidden trail leading into the dense thicket of trees nearby. Curiosity piqued. He followed it, his senses heightened as each step revealed signs of recent passage. Footprints marked the soft earth. Twigs snapped cleanly beneath unseen boots. Finally, the path opened into a clearing, revealing a scene that left him utterly speechless. Before him stood not a campsite, but a makeshift fortress. Logs reinforced the perimeter, forming barriers that shielded whatever lay within. Tents lined the outer edges, but at the center stood a structure unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, a crude laboratory of sorts, filled with strange contraptions and glowing devices. Tubes connected various apparatuses, steam rising from pressure gauges while dials spun erratically. Papers littered the ground, sketches and calculations scrawled hastily in ink. And amidst it all, a single figure worked feverishly, oblivious to his intrusion. The man was older, his hair streaked with gray, yet his eyes burned with intensity as he adjusted a device resembling a clockwork mechanism. His hands trembled slightly, whether from excitement or exhaustion. Thomas couldn't tell. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, drawing the man's attention. "What is this place?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man turned, startled, but quickly composed himself. "You shouldn't be here," he replied, though without malice. Instead, there was resignation in his tone, as though he'd expected such an encounter eventually. "But what are you doing?" Thomas pressed, unable to tear his gaze from the bizarre machinery surrounding them. The man sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as though overwhelmed. "Experiments," he admitted finally. "Things that should remain buried, perhaps. But I couldn't stop myself. Progress demands sacrifice, doesn't it?" Sacrifice. The word echoed in Thomas's mind, chilling him to the bone. Sacrifices for progress often came at great cost, and the implications of what he witnessed chilled him further. Yet, before he could press further, the man gestured toward a corner of the clearing, where a large crate rested, partially covered by a tarp. "Look," the man urged, his voice tinged with sorrow. "This is why they chose this location, why they guard it so fiercely." Thomas hesitated, then lifted the tarp, gasping audibly at what lay beneath. Weapons, not ordinary rifles or pistols, but advanced firearms, capable of destruction far beyond anything known during this era. Alongside them were explosives, their designs intricate and deadly. Each item bore markings unfamiliar to him, suggesting origins far removed from the Wild West. They planned to sell these, the man explained grimly, to anyone willing to pay. Wars will rage because of this technology, lives lost without cause. And I created it. Tears welled in the man's eyes, his voice breaking as he confessed his role in this madness. Thomas listened, horrified yet fascinated, realizing the depth of conspiracy extending far beyond these hills. These weren't mere bandits or smugglers. They were agents of change, albeit destructive ones, exploiting advancements for profit and power. In that moment, Thomas faced a choice far greater than before. To expose this operation would mean bringing attention to forces far more dangerous than he imagined. To remain silent would allow atrocities to unfold unchecked. As he stared at the weapons, the laboratory, and the broken man before him, he understood the burden placed upon his shoulders. This was no longer just a mystery. It was a mission, one that demanded courage and resolve. And so, with newfound purpose, Thomas prepared to act, knowing full well the risks involved. For in the Wild West, where lawlessness reigned and secrets thrived, sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with guns, but with truth. Thomas stood frozen in the clearing, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like an invisible hand. The man before him, clearly a scientist driven by ambition, and now consumed by guilt, watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. "You have to understand," the man pleaded, his voice cracking under the strain of emotion. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It started as research, a way to push boundaries, to make life better. But they found me, and they twisted it into something monstrous." The scientist's words hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint hum of the strange machines surrounding them. Thomas glanced around the makeshift laboratory, his mind racing. The crates of weapons, the glowing devices, the sketches scattered across the ground, all of it pointed to a conspiracy far more sinister than anything he had imagined. These weren't just tools of destruction. They were pieces of a puzzle that could alter the course of history itself. "But why here?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why so far from everything?" The scientist sighed deeply, running a trembling hand through his graying hair. "Because no one looks twice at a campfire in the middle of nowhere. They thought it would be safe, hidden in plain sight. And they were right until you came along." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He knew he couldn't simply walk away from this. Whatever happened next, he had to act. But how? How could one man take on such a vast operation, especially when even the slightest misstep could cost him everything? As if reading his thoughts, the scientist added, "If you go back there and tell them you saw this, they'll kill you." No hesitation. They've already proven they'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. A chill ran down Thomas's spine at the grim certainty in the man's voice. He glanced toward the entrance of the clearing, where the hidden trail led back to the abandoned campsite. Beyond that lay the hills, his ranch, and the life he had known for so long. Yet none of it felt safe anymore, not after what he had uncovered tonight. "Tell me who they are," Thomas demanded, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "Who are these people, and who sent you?" The scientist hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and survival. Finally he spoke, his voice low but urgent. "They call themselves the Vanguard, a group of wealthy investors, politicians, and military figures, all working together to control the future. They fund experiments like mine, hoping to gain an edge over everyone else. And when those experiments succeed..." He trailed off, gesturing helplessly toward the crates of weapons. "This is what happens." Thomas frowned, trying to process the enormity of what he was hearing. The Vanguard, a shadowy organization manipulating technology and power behind closed doors. It sounded almost unbelievable, like something out of a story told around a campfire on a lonely night. But the evidence before him was undeniable. The weapons, the machinery, the desperation in the scientist's eyes. It all pointed to a truth too dangerous to ignore. "And you?" Thomas asked, his gaze locking onto the man. "What about you? Are you part of them? Or are you a prisoner like the rest of us?" The scientist flinched at the question, averting his eyes. "I was willing once," he admitted quietly. "I believed in their vision, in the idea of progress at any cost. But then I saw what it really meant. The lives destroyed, the wars fueled by greed. When I tried to stop, they threatened my family. So I stayed, doing what they asked, praying someone would come along and expose the truth." Thomas clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just about a few renegades hiding in the wilderness. It was about a network of corruption reaching into the highest levels of society. And if no one stopped them, the consequences could ripple outward, affecting countless innocent people. But stopping them wouldn't be easy, not without a plan. "All right," Thomas said finally, his tone resolute. "We need to get word to someone who can help, someone with authority, maybe even law enforcement in the nearest town." The scientist shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. They have eyes everywhere. If you go to the authorities, they'll silence you before you can finish your sentence. Believe me, I've seen it happen." Thomas paused, frustration mounting. If traditional methods wouldn't work, then what options remained? He scanned the clearing again, searching for inspiration. His gaze landed on one of the glowing devices, a small, intricate contraption connected to a series of wires. Curiosity piqued. He stepped closer, examining it carefully. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the device. The scientist frowned, glancing nervously at the machine. "That's a transmitter, part of my project. It can send signals over long distances using electromagnetic waves. It's still experimental, though I haven't perfected it yet." An idea sparked in Thomas's mind, igniting a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. Can it reach the nearest town? Or further? The scientist hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Possibly. With some adjustments, maybe, but it won't be easy. The signal needs to be encoded properly, and we need a receiver on the other end capable of decoding it." Thomas considered the risks and rewards. Using the transmitter might be their only chance to alert others without putting themselves directly in harm's way. But setting it up would require time, and time was something they likely didn't have much of. "Do you trust me?" Thomas asked suddenly, meeting the scientist's gaze. The man blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes, I do." "Good," Thomas replied, his resolve hardening. "Then let's fix that transmitter. We're going to send a message tonight, whether they like it or not." For hours, the two men worked tirelessly, hunched over the glowing device in the dim light of the clearing. The scientist explained the mechanics of the transmitter, while Thomas helped assemble components, improvising solutions when necessary. Despite the urgency of the situation, there was a strange sense of camaraderie between them, a shared understanding that this task was their last hope. As dawn began to break, casting pale streaks of light across the horizon, the transmitter finally came to life. A soft hum filled the air as the device powered up, its dials spinning and lights blinking in sequence. The scientist adjusted the frequency settings, muttering under his breath as he fine-tuned the signal. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his voice tense with anticipation. The scientist took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as we'll ever be." With a final adjustment, the scientist activated the transmitter. A beam of energy shot skyward, invisible but powerful, carrying their message into the unknown. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, a distant crackle echoed through the air, a response from somewhere far beyond the hills. "They got it," the scientist whispered, relief flooding his features. Before either man could celebrate, however, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the fragile calm. Both froze, exchanging panicked glances, as the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel grew louder. "They're coming!" Thomas hissed, grabbing the scientist by the arm. "We need to hide. Together." They dove behind a cluster of boulders near the edge of the clearing, holding their breath as shadows emerged from the tree-line. Armed figures moved cautiously into view, rifles drawn and expressions grim. At their lead was a scar-faced leader from the campsite, his piercing eyes scanning the area with predatory intensity. "Search the place," the leader ordered, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Every inch. Find out what happened here." Thomas clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to reveal himself. If they were discovered now, all would be lost. The scientist beside him trembled slightly, but Thomas squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, silently urging him to stay calm. Minutes stretched into eternity as the intruders scoured the clearing. They examined the abandoned equipment, muttered among themselves, and eventually turned their attention toward the boulders where Thomas and the scientist hid. Heart pounding, Thomas prepared for the worst, gripping a rock tightly in his hand. But then, just as one of the men approached their hiding spot, a distant shout rang out. "Over here! Look what I found!" The leader barked orders, redirecting his men toward the source of the noise. Thomas and the scientist exchanged a glance, both breathing a little easier as the immediate danger passed. Yet, neither dared to relax completely, not while the vanguard still hunted them. When the coast was clear, Thomas rose to his feet, helping the scientist to his feet as well. "We need to move," he said firmly. "Now." The scientist nodded, his face set with determination. "Where are we going?" "Away from here," Thomas replied, leading the way toward the hidden trail, and straight into the heart of the storm.